Hello and welcome. I'm Daryl Ehrlich, and this is the Billings Gazette Stories of Honor 2019. Today I'm in studio with Ed Saunders, and I am really excited because I've known Ed for many years, and since I've come back, and it's really fun to talk to him and get to know him a little bit better. And Ed, thank you for coming here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me, Daryl.
You bet. So I always start with the same. If you've watched the series, I start with the same because I find it's really interesting. Tell us about the beginning. Where were you born and raised? Tell me about your background.
Well, I was born in western Nebraska to a very lower middle class couple who were struggled most all their life. We moved to west central Wyoming when I was a boy because, of all things, my father was chasing a bail bond skip. And he got a job in the Riverton, Wyoming Police Department because of that. So on Memorial Day weekend, 1964, we all packed everything we owned and in a homemade cargo trailer moved from Gering, Nebraska to Riverton, Wyoming. It took us 2 days to get there. I grew up in a Riverton. It was at that time a 40 grit ranching and mining town. I was a shy kid, didn't make friends easily. I really didn't know why we were there. But I grew up in western Wyoming, and because of that and my father's very strong work ethic, you became a self-reliant man, and you also appreciated the suffering and the hard work that people put in. It was a largely conservative area, and I grew up in the civil rights era and also in the Vietnam era, where even the conservatives where I grew were questioning what we were doing. And that questioning is always wise, I think, for people to pause for a little bit and say, what is America doing then? I registered for the draft when I was 18, and when the draft lottery numbers came out for Vietnam, that was the only time I ever won the lottery. My draft number was 009, and the rule on the street was if your draft number was 125 or lower, then you were Long Binh bound. You were going to the first repo depot in Long Binh, South Vietnam. And I showed the newspaper list of the numbers to my dad, and he just turned white. My father was a combat veteran of World War II in the Army in the Pacific at age 19, by the way. And Dad just turned white, and I said, Dad, if I gotta go, I gotta go. But I was never called up because the United States was in the Vietnamization program at that time, and the draft essentially had shut down. I knew that for me to get anywhere in life, I had to get an education. My father was the first member of his family ever to get a high school diploma, and I knew that I had to get a college degree. I went to the University of Wyoming in Laramie, entered the Army ROTC program. And I remember telling my colonel down there, I said, Colonel, you got to know something. I'm number 9 on the draft. And he looked at me and said, Saunders, you're not going anywhere. So I think he knew something I didn't. I graduated from Laramie, 4 years, 8 semesters. I never took summer school. And I was commissioned second lieutenant in the United States Regular Army. I was an RA officer my entire Army career. And I stayed. I found the Army to my liking. I liked being in the field. I liked the ruggedness of it, and I liked moving around the world. I married a year after I was commissioned to a wonderful little redhead Irish girl I'd met in Laramie, and she followed me all over the world and bore me a son. And I stayed and served 22 years and 16 days in the U.S. Army, survived a war. I do know what a bullet sounds like when it passes your head, going the wrong way. And retired because I got hurt in the Gulf War. I wasn't combat wounded. I do not have a Purple Heart, but the injuries in the Gulf War just began to catch up with me, and I knew I had to retire. Retired, went to work for corporate America in defense industries. It was a coat and tie job. I hated every minute of it. Paid good, but my wife and I became empty nesters. She's a Wyoming native, and I said, let's just go home. So I followed her. She worked over 20 years with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs in their medical section. Charlene worked at the medical centers in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and here. She made a career serving veterans, and God bless the military families who follow us. They don't get the credit they deserve. We moved to Billings, where Charlene worked in the VA medical clinic here, and I began working veterans issues on local, state, and national in a national area, and that's why we're here, and that's what I do.
Okay, why? I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I want to stay kind of in the present. Why? What made you after coat and tie job? You had earned almost two retirements, one from coat and tie job and one from the Army. Why did you get involved in veterans affairs and stuff? Why didn't you go fishing?
First, I never was a good fisherman, but it's kind of an ethos that in the military, especially for officers who command units. We command units not for ego, and we certainly don't get any pay for doing it, any more pay for doing it, but we do it as a measure of service. We know that in our experience, in our training, we can organize a group of dissimilar people, in this case, soldiers from all walks of life, and in my case, both genders, and we mold them to achieve a goal which singularly they could not do. And when you retire from the Army, or in my case from the Army, other cases of the military services, by the way, my wife and my son is a former active duty Marine, and we're very proud of him for that. You look at how best you can continue to serve, and it's not because it's a self-serving ego trip, but it's a calling that courses through you. It's a pretty hard thing to describe. But when you see a need, especially with veterans, mostly men, who are struggling with coming to grips of their service and how to continue with their life, you think in a practical sense and maybe in a compassionate sense, you know how to help them. And to step away from that, I think is, well, I wouldn't do it. When you see someone who needs help and you just walk away from them, that's an indictment on you as a man. And when I saw fellow veterans who needed help, and they didn't know where to go or who to talk to, all of my Army training and experience just told me, and my experience is just, a Christian man. You put all that together and say, it is my responsibility to help these men and women, and I can't just walk away from them.
Sure. What kind of help do you see men and women who are coming back today need most?
They need an assurance that, first, they are not forgotten. I think the greatest tragedy that can happen to an American serviceman or woman now is not that they may possibly even be killed in action. The greatest tragedy is they're forgotten, that they do these remarkable and courageous things worldwide in extraordinarily dangerous and hostile places. And they would come back, or maybe come back to a nation that just doesn't even remember them. It doesn't even fully comprehend what they do, especially the younger men and women, 19, 20 years of age. And they need that assurance that we as a people, we as a nation, and we as a community, friends and family, are there to help them. And that asking for help is not an admission of failure or being less a person. It is saying that your courage still exists in asking for help. Yeah. And that's why I do a lot of this.
Why do you think soldiers today are forgotten or are in danger of being forgotten?
The wars that we have now, and that word war is in quotation marks because we're not sure what they are. In World War II, it was probably the last popular war in American history. My father was 19 when he was drafted. My late father-in-law was 17 when he enlisted in the Navy. Both of these men were combat veterans, combat battle veterans, when they were teenagers. World War II was a popular war, a lot of support. We knew what the objective was: defeat Nazi Germany, defeat Imperial Japan. Then came Korea. We didn't quite sure what Korea was all about. And then Vietnam. Vietnam stands alone in a tragedy that America did not know what it was doing. It wasn't a tragedy for the individual people that served in uniform, because they were heroic men and women. But when they came back, the nation took out its uncertainty on them, and it shouldn't have done that. America now has almost an entire generation of young men and women who have always known war. The Iraq-Afghanistan conflict, see, I use the word conflict, I don't know what to call it, but when you're a soldier or Marine getting shot at, you don't care about the word. All you know is somebody's trying to kill you, and that's war. But we have a generation of young men and women who have known nothing but reading about Americans getting killed somewhere on the other side of the planet in a hostile gunfire situation. And how do we approach that now? And when you bring back a younger person, and they have seen things that were unimaginable. They've heard about it. They may have heard Grandpa talk about the war, or Uncle Jack talk about Da Nang, or Ed Saunders talking about the Gulf War, the Battle of Khafji, where I was in. But listening to it and experiencing it, two different things. And a younger mind, when they see these unimaginable traumatic events, skews them a bit. They will not get over it. I told a younger veteran who came back from Afghanistan, I said, unfortunately, you are not going to get over this, but you will get through this a stronger man. And I said, you've got two choices here, and we will help you, that you can be a better man or a bitter man. Which one's it going to be? And I see me as helping this younger generation as best I can. And America doesn't know what to do with these younger men and women, because the war is not something which affects us every day. In World War II, it did affect America with rationing, the draft, and all those sorts of things. Now, it's just a sidelight on the back page somewhere, an occasional opinion that's written. It's like, well, it's a 5 o'clock news slot. What are the hockey scores tonight? Yeah. And that's what we have to guard against.
Are the soldiers who are coming back today? You knew your dad's generation. You knew your generation of Vietnam. You saw a new generation when you were half a planet away, as you put it, and you're seeing the soldiers return today. Are the soldiers today qualitatively different than your father's generation on what they face when they come back?
Yes, they are.
In what way?
Coming back from war, America was certainly patriotic, supportive. The brass bands, the banners, and the parades and everything. Being a popular war where young men wanted to go and prove themselves. It was sort of a national coming of age where a young guy, in the Civil War they called it, they wanted to see the elephant, meaning I want to prove myself as a man. And I've been, like my dad, he grew up on an old dirt farm in Nebraska, and he had a chance to go to war. My goodness, yes, I'll do that. I'll get out and plow in the ground. But when the veterans in World War II started to come back hurt, America didn't know what to do. And this genesis of what do we do with terribly hurt veterans, not only from physical wounds but mental wounds. We did not know about what was called shell shock, 1,000-yard stare. It's now called post-traumatic stress disorder, as to how the horror of war affects the way your mind works. America didn't know about that. And there was always seemed to be a veteran somewhere in town that was shaking a lot and maybe a little bit scared, drinking a lot. And he was talked about in quiet terms. People knew it, but they didn't want to bring him forth. As this military, as a society, when we went to Korea and certainly Vietnam, we still struggled with that. In the Gulf War, where I served in war, America was trying in its early steps to correct all of that, to become more, I want to say modern in its view, but more educated, more involved in the post-war, the post-military services or experiences of the soldiers and the military. When the military is coming back from overseas like Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth now, they are entering a society which I believe, and I have seen, more wanting to recognize not only their service, but recognize the responsibility that America has to help them. And this help is manifested by, first, just an awareness, an accepted awareness that did not exist in post-World War to Korea and certainly Vietnam, but and a little bit in the Gulf War when I came back. But now that awareness is much higher. But unfortunately, after almost 20 years of war in Iraq, Afghanistan, maybe America is getting complacent about that awareness and maybe thinking, well, we want to help and it's good that we help, but, well, you know, the NHL hockey game's on tonight and I want to watch it. So that's my concern, is America is getting complacent. To give you another example of that, and I've got to walk into this one carefully because it sounds a little bit coarse. I hear the phrase, "Thank you for your service." And I appreciate that. And I think veterans, especially battle veterans, appreciate this. But I'm concerned it may be becoming an obligatory platitude, that people are quoting a bumper sticker and they don't fully grasp what they are saying and the dimension that they are saying. I'm glad that they do, but I think it's becoming overused, and America is saying it because what else are they going to say?
Yeah. Is there something, I don't want to say, are there other words, but when they say that, what dimension, where does your mind go, and what do you think when they say that?
I think that they feel obligated, that in some manner it's not so much sincere, that it is kind of an obligation to say that. What would I like for them to say? Thank you.
Yeah.
We recognize it, and we thank you, and mean it sincerely.
Yeah. I want to jump back now in your life. I'm going to go back and I'm going to work my way up a little. We'll get back to the present, but for right now, I want to go back. So you have a really high draft, or really low, but high. It looks like you're going to be drafted, but we're going through Vietnamization. Some people would have said, "Phew," and I don't mean to use I've used this phrase, and I shouldn't in these interviews. I dodged a bullet. I didn't have to go. but you decided that military life agreed with you, and went through the ROTC and took the commission. Um, some people would say that's running towards something when others are running away. Why did you decide that that was something that you were going to do with your life?
Well, first, again, I said I came from a very conservative background, salt of the earth people. They were Depression era American dirt farmers, sort of like the Jodes and Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. Um, so service to America, waving the flag, was what we did. You know, my dad was a conservative war veteran, proud patriot man, and I thought if I got to go to Vietnam, I'm going to go. That's just the way it was. Growing up, I thought I pretty much concluded I would be one of three professions that I deem honorably and noble. First, I wanted to be a judge of the law in the shadow of District Judge Ewing T. Kerr in Wyoming. He was Moses, and I met Judge Kerr, and I said, "What a remarkable man." Some of his decisions were upheld by the United States Supreme Court, by the way. I also wanted to be a minister of the gospel. I come from a Protestant Christian family who did believe in God and Jesus Christ, and I was a churchgoer. And I thought maybe the ministry is something that I need to do. And finally, I said I wanted to be, or could easily be, I thought then, an officer in the United States Army, because I felt that was a very honorable thing to serve. Well, I never could get past the LSAT law school exam. And I think the good Lord said, "Ed, you're too salty to be behind a pulpit." No.
I can relate.
So I became an officer in the Army, and I never looked back.
Yeah.
Never looked back.
Your dad, you said when the number came up, 009, that your dad turned white.
Yes, he did.
Did he ever explain why he turned white? I mean, he's conservative. Did he ever tell you why he was turning white?
No, Dad never talked about the war.
Okay.
Until much later in life, when I came back from ground combat in the Persian Gulf War. And he and I were talking about war, and he said this just once. He said, in the invasion of the Philippine Islands, he was 19 years old, and they were in the invasion of Lingayen Gulf in January 1945. Dad was a Higgins boat driver, an assault boat driver, a landing craft driver. And he said they were coming into the beach, and he said the boat to his port side, the left side of the boat, or the left side, was getting too close to him. And Dad was hollering for this boat to move off, to wave off. And he said the boat took a direct hit from Japanese shell fire. And he said the boat broke in half and went up, and he said the boat disappeared in pink mist. And he said he saw bodies in the water, and Dad said he couldn't stop to help. He had to go through the bodies to get the men on shore. And he only told me about this much later in life. And in retrospect, I think he was thinking of that I was his age when I was 18 when the draft numbers came out. And in retrospect, I think that's Dad. He was thinking what he went through, and that I possibly could be going to Vietnam. Vietnam at that time, it was clear it wasn't working. You know, tens of thousands of America's finest had been killed. And I think Dad knew that. And he looked at me thinking that I was going to experience that. And I think that's why he turned white.
Yeah. Was it hard to, I mean, it's one thing to have a draft number and to be drafted. You weren't drafted, but you chose the military career. Was it hard choosing a military career when it was clear Vietnam wasn't working?
Not for me.
Okay.
going into the Army at that time was largely a business decision for me. In 1974, America was in an economic recession. Post-war economies generally collapse on you. War is good for business. And I knew that in Wyoming, the only opportunities you had as a young man, it was you go into the mines, you go on the drilling rigs, or you go into ranching. And you'll be dead or an old man by the time you're 40. And I said, I have to get out of here, and the only way to do that is an education. And to get into the Army, I could get scholarships, financial aid. And if I didn't care for it, I only had a 6-year obligation. And being an Army officer would look good on a resume. So it was largely a business decision. And I got into ROTC. I thought about applying to West Point, but at that time, West Point was looking for maybe a much more vibrant man, and I have always been a quiet fella. And so I chose ROTC. And graduated, was commissioned, and got into the Army and started a unit command as platoon leader. And I found it to my liking.
What about it? You said that several times. What is it that you liked about it?
I like the ruggedness of it. I grew up in western Wyoming. I hiked in the Wind River Wilderness. I liked being outside, and I liked the activity, and I liked the challenge. My first assignment in the Army, actually, I was a unit commander as a second lieutenant because they didn't have a lot of officers. And my specialty, by the way, in the Army was explosive ordnance disposal. I commanded Army bomb disposal teams. And I enjoyed the challenge. I enjoyed the excitement.
Yeah. There's a lower margin for error, right?
In my business, yes. But I enjoyed it. We were outside a lot. There was a lot of activity, a lot of excitement, a lot of challenges, physical challenges. And I liked that. I enjoyed it. I got a lot of self-satisfaction, not to serve an ego, but self-satisfaction in knowing that I organized a team and we got difficult things done. And when I retired, somebody was asking me about, hey, Ed, what medals did you get? And I said, that's not important to me, and it's not. I said, the greatest accomplishment I had in my Army career was that I accomplished all my missions in peacetime and in war. And in the accomplishment of those missions, no member of my command or no soldier in my charge was ever killed, wounded, captured, or even injured. I got the job done, and I brought my people home. I brought them home.
Yep. In 1974, Vietnam is winding down, Saigon falls, I believe in 74. Mm-hmm. And it looks like, at least for ostensibly, America's out of war. America had wanted out of war. It got out of war, and it looks like that Ed Saunders is going to be peacetime officer. Is that what you're thinking? Or walk me back to that. What are you thinking your military career? It's still the Cold War, but it's a Cold War, not a hot war like Vietnam.
I really didn't know. I knew the Army had opportunities worldwide, and I thought that I could request an assignment pretty much worldwide. And I was thinking, well, any place other than Riverton, Wyoming. But the Army, I graduated, I got commissioned, and I got trained up in the Army, and the Army said, here's where we need you. And they gave me a list, and I wanted to be assigned to Fort Lewis, Washington, near up around Seattle, because it's a beautiful area. And they said, no, you're going to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, in the Missouri Ozarks. I said, okay. But I enjoyed it there, rural America. And I began to think, do I want to make the Army a career? Of course, this was the immediate post-Vietnam era, and America was struggling, the Army was struggling, and so forth. But I liked the challenge. And I had recently married then. My wife and I had a little baby who is now almost 40 years old. And I talked with her about it, and I said, what do you think? And she said, if you're happy, I'm happy. And I said, okay. I said, well, we have a chance to go to Europe now, being assigned to a unit in Europe. And my wife spoke elementary German from her collegiate experience. And I said, okay, let's go to Europe. And that's what we did. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I knew that possibly wars could come, but if you're a fireman or a policeman, you have to come to the realization that you're going to be called into some serious things at least once or twice in your life. And if you can't handle that, then you need to seek employment elsewhere.
Yeah.
And I stayed in the Army.
What's your, as you look back on a career, did you have a favorite assignment, a favorite place?
Oh, that's a tough one. They're all different. I enjoyed cultures. And when we had 2 tours of duty in Europe, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. We got to travel a lot. Unfortunately, in the early 80s, because of my background and my job in the Army, we had to contend with terrorist activities directed against the armed forces in Germany. And then when I finished that, we came back to the States for some schooling for me. And a friend of mine said, hey, Ed, would you like to be a military advisor to a foreign country? And I said, yeah, that sounds good. And he said, well, I'm just coming out of Bangkok, Thailand. Would you like to go to Thailand for a couple of years? I said, yeah, great idea. And I called the Pentagon, the assignments officer, and he said, Ed, you missed it by a week. And he said, but I've got an advisory job in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Would you like to go there? Of course, this was in early 1990. And I said, sure, that sounds great. And my wife looked at me and said, well, okay. She looked a little hesitant, but we went over there and we landed in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. I was an advisor to the Saudi military, specifically the Saudi Arabian National Guard, which is not like the National Guard in America. The National Guard in Saudi Arabia is an internal military force. We moved there in July of 1990. And one evening in early August, we were having pizza down at the diplomatic quarter in Riyadh when somebody came up to us and said, are you men from PM Sang, which was our advisory unit? And our advisory unit had been in Saudi Arabia since 1976, fully funded by the Saudi government. Our son went to a private school in Riyadh funded by the Saudis. It really was an idyllic life. But this guy, he looked at us and I said, who's asking? And he said, well, you need to get back to your unit immediately. And we went back to our housing area, and there was a note from Major General Taylor, our commander, and he said, everybody over to my house immediately. Come as you are. And so we went over to General Taylor's quarters, and he said, the Iraqis have invaded Kuwait in great strength, and we need the teams to go to the border immediately. And it changed just like that. And we deployed to the Kuwaiti border within hours with the Saudi 2nd Brigade. And we were on the border almost immediately. And for the better part of about 2 weeks, the Saudi 2nd Brigade, Infantry Brigade, and a handful of American advisors, me being one of them, were the only force between the Iraqis and Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. You ask about the best, the assignment that gave me the most reward. That was it, for a variety of different reasons. I enjoyed the culture. I enjoyed the people. It gave a lot of satisfaction culturally. My wife and my son were there, by the way, during the war. I couldn't get them out, which is another story. The other one was immediately after that, I was assigned to headquarters, United States Army Europe. And I was the chief of logistics current operations for the U.S. Army there. The war in Bosnia was going on. And I had to come up with refugee relief operations. And that gave me a tremendous satisfaction to organize some things with the U.S. Army in Europe to support the refugees in Bosnia. It always came down to helping the refugees and especially the children. And I got to be careful with this one, Daryl. You know, you and I were talking a while back, and it got to me. But a military force against a military force is one thing. But when you have families, little children in between those two warring forces, that'll get to your heart really quick. So having a chance to help those refugee families in Bosnia gave me great satisfaction.
Yeah. When I want to go back to the Riyadh moment, and did you have any idea that it would change? I mean, that moment, that Kuwaiti invasion. I mean, I think if you're an American, I remember this is gonna make you this is probably not gonna make you happy. I was in high school when it happened, but things changed very rapidly, and it seemed like that kind of set a trajectory for the Mideast that still maybe is continuing today. Did you have any idea what was going on, or how did you view it at the time?
Well, I did my homework before we went over there. In fact, my wife and I attended some special seminars in Washington, D.C. that talked about the culture, the religion, the history of it. And as an Army officer, I did my own homework, the history of the Middle East, beginning really with World War I. You can walk it back to biblical times, but I didn't do that. I started World War I and walked it forward to understand as best I could the factions involved, the political situations involved. And I knew that I had to be a culturally sensitive man, which I think I am. Daryl, you know, I'm kind of a quiet fella, and I think being a polite Western man helped me throughout the world and accepting people as they are. And so when we arrived there knowing that we did not want to be the ugly Americans, that we wanted to be friendly, polite, culturally sensitive, and we were, not in a condescending way, but in a genuine way of friendship and politeness. But when we knew that there was instability there, from the Arab-Israeli wars in 67 and 73, and we knew that that may occur again, but not where we were. We figured Israel and the Arab factions up there just might start shooting at each other again. We realized that, but we didn't think it would come to our front door. And when it did come to our front door, it was an eye-opener, and I was conflicted in caring for my family, but doing my military duty. I couldn't get my family out because civilian airlines stopped flying into Riyadh. And the U.S. State Department did not declare Riyadh as a zone of evacuation. So the State Department did not authorize evacuation of American civilians. And long story about this. My wife is in a better position to talk about it than I, but the American families, especially the women, there were 40 families in Riyadh that banded together, and their story is heroic, and very few people know about it. But that's what we faced when, the moment came. As I said, I've got to get my family out of here, and then I've got to go to the front and just do the best I can.
Yeah. What was your opinion at the time of Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq?
Negative. A Middle East strongman, okay, in the guise of Muammar Gaddafi, Nasser in Egypt, and so forth. Just a Middle Eastern strongman that had a lot of guns. But I knew that I thought maybe he would try to do something against Israel, and that he had the force to do it, and that if there was going to be any sort of hostility, it would have been Israel and Iraq. Now, you had to remember that at that time, Iraq and Iran had been at war for almost 20 years. And I just thought there's might be some border skirmishes or something like that, but nothing like a full-scale invasion of another country.
Was that shocking to you?
Yes.
That he did it?
Yes.
What was, did you have much interaction with Kuwait? Because you're right down there. Riyadh is not far from Kuwait, correct?
Correct. It's well, they border. They share a common border. We had interaction with the Kuwaiti military, such as it was. But mostly we were assisting in the training and logistical preparation, weapons, munitions, and so forth with the Saudis. And we had interacted with the Kuwaitis. We had interacted with other allied forces, like from Sudan and a couple of African countries. I enjoyed that interaction. They were professional men, courageous men. But when you are facing an armored force with experienced military, such as in Iraq, it'd be like you and I stepping in the ring with Muhammad Ali in his prime. We know that we had better be careful.
Right. And you said that you were culturally sensitive, and I believe that in Saudi Arabia. What was your opinion? Because we know that the Saudi culture is very different than the American culture.
It is.
How was your adjustment inside Saudi Arabia?
The adjustment was smooth. We, when I say we, I, my wife, and our then 10-year-old son, we had been in the military. We had moved around. I was in my early 30s. I had been in the Army for over 10 years. So we had also been overseas in Europe. So the idea of being in a culture, a different culture, was not new to us. But going into an Islamic culture, especially in Saudi Arabia, which is home to the Holy Mosque, as they call it, over in Mecca, we were careful. My wife, Charlene, knew that restrictions were placed on women and that she had to comply with that carefully. But the American women over there were pretty capable people, and they knew that being good ambassadors and being polite people can go a long way. They couldn't drive, but you wouldn't want to drive in Riyadh. They had little ticket books that the taxis would take them downtown. You didn't want to drive in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. I didn't even want to drive there.
What, bad, poor driver?
Oh my gosh, they drive on the sidewalks down there. It's crazy. But we adjusted well. We were intellectually curious, and we were culturally curious. We would go into the city and shop, we knew the rules. There were societal norms that you had to follow, which we didn't see as that terrible. It wouldn't wash over here, of course, but over there we were sensitive to it, and we didn't have any trouble. The one brand new officer came over there and unfortunately had sort of an attitude and caused a scene, and he was put on the plane and departed within 48 hours.
At what point did you know? I mean, obviously, this wasn't the Kuwait-Iraq, the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq was not a minor skirmish. It wasn't a flash in the pan.
No.
At what point did you know something had changed and that you were this was going to take on a different dimension? This was different than being on alert.
When we were ordered to the border,
Okay.
when General Taylor ordered us to the border, I went to the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border. I'm sorry, to the Saudi-Kuwaiti border, a couple of miles north of Kafji, and I deployed with 2 uniforms, a sack of groceries, and a Michelin travel guide map. We had no firearms, no guns, no rifles, and I went up there in a Chevy Blazer truck. And I thought, we are either brave or we are very foolish. If the Iraqis come across the Saudi border, we are in serious trouble, and we're going to have to turn around and leave as fast as we can. I got to the border, and on the border there's this big, tall sand berm called the berm, the border berm. And I crawled at the top of that berm and looked over the Al Wafra oil field with my binoculars, and I could see the Iraqi combat vehicles. And I knew then that we had better be careful, that we were in serious trouble.
What was the buildup, or what was the lead up then? If you could see that, then what did we do to prepare? What did the Saudis do with our help to prepare?
The Saudi 2nd Brigade, which was an infantry brigade, had deployed to the border on the initiative of the Saudi prince of that area, which was remarkable. Normally you have to have the king's approval to do things, but he did it on his own. So the force was on the Saudi-Kuwaiti border, and President Bush at that time said, we are going to start sending troops. And we were on the border, we were very chill, hallelujah, the cavalry is coming. But the 82nd Airborne didn't come for another week or few days. And when they came into Dammam, a seaport on the east coast of Saudi Arabia. They didn't come up to where we were. And we were thinking, hey guys, come on,
Right.
we need your help. But the buildup was steady, but we were on the border, and at midnight on January 28th, 1991, the Iraqis hit us at Kafji.
So you're sitting there, and the border are sand berms between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
Is it an eerie thing to look across and where there should be Kuwaiti? I'm guessing there should be Kuwaiti vehicles, Kuwaiti flags, Kuwaiti machinery. It's Iraqi.
Yes. And
Disturbing?
Unsettling.
Yeah.
And they were only, from the berm to the Al Wafra oil field was a mile, I would think, not a mile and a half. And very disturbing because they had main battle tanks and we didn't. We were in essence taking Chihuahua to a pit bull fight. And we knew that we could not hold them, that we could fight a delaying action, which we did, eventually did. And but we knew we had American air support, and we were going to rely heavily on that.
Did that make you feel, were you confident in American air support?
I didn't know.
Okay.
I just didn't know. I knew in my particular situation that when the Iraqis, if the Iraqis were going to attack, and they eventually did, that I would report it, get back in my truck, and just stand on the gas and get out of there. And an American Army officer doesn't like to get chased out of anywhere.
Right.
But we were. Again, we didn't have the firepower to stand up to him, and we had to turn and leave. We came back eventually. We withdrew out of Khafji twice because the Iraqis hit us from the north and from the northwest. They had tanks, we didn't, and we had to leave and regroup and counterattack later on.
And that's because you had to retreat because they could have, if they would have been successful, you could have been trapped, right?
We were outgunned.
Right.
We were outgunned, and we knew it, and we could have been cut off, but we just weren't thinking that way. We knew we had to withdraw, slow them down, regroup south of Khafji on the bluffs at Safaniya, and then counterattack. It was right on the Persian Gulf, so the aircraft carrier, oh goodness, there was a naval aircraft carrier out there that could bring in air support, and we knew that. So we were going to back off and call in tactical air and hit them that way.
Right. I want to stop real quickly because I'm going to come back to it, but I want to stop. What does it look like around that? Describe the Khafji area or Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. I mean, I think of it as just miles of sand, but I'm guessing
it is.
Is it? Is it? Okay, so this is desert.
It is desert. In central Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of mountains, lava mountains, and the sand there in central Saudi Arabia is red. The sand along the eastern part of Saudi Arabia is very light colored. It's almost white. Very few little scrub brush. By the way, Saudi Arabia has 10,000-foot pine tree covered mountains in the southwest part of the country. We went down there later and had a good time. But the topography is flat sand. It's visually difficult because there are no land masses. Like here in Montana, you could look.
It's going to be very disorienting to a kid from Wyoming.
It is.
There's always.
And you just looked at it and say, this is just to the horizon. You see flat sand, and it's visually unsettling because you can't get a reference as to where you are. Khafji at that time was a seacoast resort town of about 8,000 or 9,000 people. People would go to Khafji and go to the beach, not in the sense of the Jersey Shore, but they would just go to the beach and walk up and down the sand and things of that nature. Khafji was about just a couple miles south of the Kuwaiti border. It had a large oil refinery there. It had a large saltwater desalination plant. And it also had a telephone telegraph station there. And we think when the Iraqis attacked, they were after the refinery, the desal plant, and the telephone telegraph building. We think is what they were doing. So it was the only battle in the Persian Gulf War fought in a town. Everything else in the Gulf War was out. It was an open tank fight in the desert. We were fighting street to street, house to house, up and down the boulevards of Khafji, and it was a street brawl.
And they were coming. They were after the Iraqis were after the desal, the refinery, and the communications. Ostensibly, this was not a counter attack for America's intervention or Saudi. Because they were coming onto the Saudi territory. Why would they open up that front?
We're not sure. Even today, we're not sure. We think maybe they were trying to force America's hand too early so that America would commit combat forces before America was ready. That's an idea. The other theory was they wanted to embarrass the Saudi government and the Saudi king in the eyes of the Arabs so that they could say, listen, the Saudi king can't even protect his own people. You know, he's a puppet of America and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, we really weren't sure why the Iraqis attacked us at Khafji. I think it was because they said, we've got to go now before America gets too strong and before America destroys us.
So let's talk about the Battle of Khafji. How did that play out? What do you remember about it starting? Because you're down there, you're seeing them. Do you know something's coming? I mean, because you've got enough military training and experience to know that there's probably some mobilization and coalescence.
Yes, we knew that they were massing up north, across the border, in a region we call the Al-Wafra region, and we saw them. They were there. And we knew, well, around midnight on January 28th, Colonel John Loggy called in. He was with one of the battalions, the Saudi battalions. He called in and he reported flares and activity to the north. That's what he called in. And we knew that the Iraqis were coming. And the Iraqis started coming at us. They attacked in two directions, one straight down the coast road at us, and also northwest. They came and attacked us from the northwest across the desert. And the Saudis put up a heck of a good fight, but it was a delaying action. The Iraqis came into town, came into the city proper, and Khafji is in two kind of regions. It'd be like in Billings, you have the heights, and then you have below the rims. Just think of the Iraqis would attack you, let's say, up in the heights, and then the battle flowed down below.
Okay.
And that's what happened. We slowed them down as best we could, but we withdrew from the city because they outgunned us. They simply outgunned us. We withdrew south of the town to regroup and then call in airstrikes and artillery, and then we counterattacked.
When that battle starts and you have to go back, you said it's hard for an army officer to retreat, and it is. I imagine it's but when did you know you had to do it, and how was that for you? What was that like?
We knew it almost immediately. We knew they had tanks, and we didn't. Or when I say we, the Saudi 2nd Brigade did not have battle tanks. We were outgunned. And the radio communications were very spotty, very confusing. We really didn't know what was going on. But we knew that the Iraqis were coming at us, and we knew we had to get out of there. I was, at any time during that 2.5-day battle, I was in a location either in Khafji proper on the very front or on the north side of Khafji, all the way back to the logistics support base, which was about 8 miles south in a place called Safaniya. We call it Squalor Junction. It was really a rat hole. But that's where the Saudi logistics base was. And so at any given day, I was either in Khafji proper or 8 miles behind at the Safaniya base, depending on what I had to do at the time. And it was a confusing situation. We tried our best to try and understand what was going on, where the Iraqis were. And on January 30th, it was on the 30th, we started to push them out. Still very confused. February 1st, which was a Friday, February 1st, 1991, about 9 in the morning, I was down at what we call Checkpoint McDonald's. The southern city gates to Khafji were in 2 arches like welcoming arches.
Right. So,
And we call the checkpoint McDonald's, like meet me at the Twin Arches. Yeah. And I was down there, and I can't remember what I was doing down there, but I was out of my vehicle and was walking over to the aid station, and a machine gun opened up on us. And it was like being in the middle of a football field. You're on the 50-yard line right in the middle of the football field, and somebody is shooting at you somewhere up in the stadium. You don't know where it is coming from, but you know you got to get out of there. And I took off on a dead run to get across the boulevard, past Checkpoint McDonald's, and over to a place, an old shot-up gas station that we were using as an aid station, where my colleague, Major Mark Lockett, was. And I covered that, I don't know, it's probably 40, 50 yards. It felt like 40 or 50 miles, and just as fast as I could run.
Yeah.
And we could not determine where the shooter was. We could not determine where that machine gun fire was coming from. And that was a time that it was all getting to me. And I thought, that was probably the only time at Kofje that I thought that maybe, just maybe, I might not get out of this. We were in an underground bunker for a little bit, and I got a telephone call from Riyadh, and one of the wives was passing information about our families. The families were still in Riyadh. We couldn't get them out. And Mrs. Tony Dickinson called me on this very bad telephone line, and she said, and I'll take this one to my grave. She said, Ed, quote, "Your family is gone," end quote. And I took a deep breath and I said, Tony, does that mean Charlene and Ben are missing and you can't find them? Does that mean Charlene and Ben have been evacuated from the country? Or does that mean Charlene and Ben are dead? And she took a deep breath and she said, oh, no, Ed, they're evacuated from the country. They flew out last night. And that short time period, two things happened to me. One, I thought, I just might not get out of this. And second, my family just might not get out of this. Later that day, we were up on the north side of Kofje. We were still taking fire, sniper fire a lot. And we were in the old fire station up there, and we were up in the hose tower trying to find out where the Iraqis were. And damn it, we were still taking bullets. And that's the only time I think I lost it. I was out in front of the old fire station, and I was just hollering. I was hollering words I can't relay now. But in essence, I was saying, bring it on. You want to fight? Bring it on. You lousy people, bring it on. Up until then, I was trying to keep a disciplined military approach to a tough situation and make good decisions. But at that time, I said, you want to fight me? Come on. Right. That lasted for about 10 minutes, and I said, you got to settle down, Ed. You got to keep a head on your shoulders.
Yeah. So were the Saudis surprised that Iraq marched toward them? Were they caught a little off guard, did they? I mean, they could see it, but it's one thing to see them coalesce, but it's another thing to have your own country invaded.
Saudis knew it was coming. They'd been paying off Saddam Hussein for years. Okay. And they knew it was coming. They being the Saudis, they knew it was coming.
Right. What was your opinion of the Iraq army?
We faced at Kofje. Now remember, Iraq had been waging war with Iran for over 20 years. And the force we faced at Kofje was a mixed bag. They had good leadership based on the tactics they used against us, but some of their soldiers were clearly conscripts. We took a lot of prisoners. One time, 40 of them came out of the basement of this building, surprised the daylights out of us. One of my colleagues had this group of 40 Iraqi soldiers surrendering to him, and all he had was a 9mm pistol. But one poignant scene was with a younger Iraqi soldier. There were about 3 or 4 of them. This one kid was crying. He was just bawling. And through an interpreter, I said, "What's going on here?" And the interpreter said they had been told that if they were captured by the Americans, we'd shoot them. And I went over to my truck, and I got a bottle of water, and I had a big juicy orange in my truck, and an orange out in the desert is gold. I can't remember how I got that orange, but I got it. So I took this bottle of water and this orange, and I went over to this bawling Iraqi kid. I mean, he looked like he was 16 or 17. And I said, "Hey, Sadiq." In Arabic, the word Sadiq means friend. And I said, "Here, Sadiq." And I tossed it to him. And he looked at me, and he was still crying, but it looked like he was crying because he knew I wasn't going to shoot him. That was a powerful moment.
Yeah. Yeah. So you get there. How did you retreat? Then you had to take Kafji again, right?
Yes,
How did that happen? How did reinforcements arrive? I imagine.
Yes, mostly air support and artillery. The Marines had come, and the Marines had attack helicopters, and the Marines had accurate artillery. The Saudis had artillery too, but not as accurate as the Marines. And we counterattacked with the Marines providing the fire support. And that proved the decisive piece to get the Iraqis out of there.
Mm-hmm. How does, what happens to a town? So this is a town. This is people live, ostensibly people live in Kafji. So how do you have a battle inside a town? What happens to the people, and how does that work?
About 2 weeks before the battle happened, this civilians in Kafji, the citizens of Kafji, knew that something bad was going to happen, and they started leaving on their own. Just a trickle every now and then. There was a refugee checkpoint about 10 miles south of Kafji on the coast road, and we called it the Speedbump Checkpoint. And one day I was there because I was going north into that area, and you could see just all kinds of vehicles packed to the hill, trucks, and they were leaving. One pickup truck had a bunch of stuff piled in the back and had 2 children in there. It always comes back to the kids. And these kids were on top of this pile of stuff. And I'm just watching them, and these kids had this look of just being stunned. They knew something was going to happen. They didn't know what. And when the truck crossed the asphalt speed bump and they were heading south, I breathed a sigh of relief. But Kafji had 8,000 or 9,000 people then. And when the Iraqis finally attacked, there was a smattering of people still there, but most of them had left. When you see a town of that size totally with no people in it, no lights at night, it's just kind of some Orwellian experience.
Yeah.
It's unlike you've never seen before. It's like some death angel has descended upon this place and has killed them all. There was nobody there other than just a few diehards.
What's night like in the desert?
Beautiful.
Why?
The evening sky in the Arabian desert is unimaginably beautiful. You cannot describe it. The stars, the Milky Way, the galaxies. Many times I would lay on my back on top of my truck, a rolled up jacket under my head, and I just marveled at this cosmic creation from the mind of God. And I said, this is so unimaginably beautiful. The desert in the evening finally calms, the wind isn't blowing. It finally cools, although in January in Saudi Arabia is the wet season. Rain will come, and it will come in torrents, but only for about a couple of minutes. But the evening in the desert, in the Arabian desert, is magical, completely magical. If you can divorce for a minute your thoughts about getting prepared for the war,
yeah,
it is magical and beautiful.
What's the hardest thing about being in the desert?
The day-to-day.
And what does day-to-day operations
life
look like for you? Yeah, as a officer in the Army.
Well, at that time, before the winter came, the heat was terrible. The heat would be over 120 degrees. It was so hot there, you didn't feel the heat. You felt that you were being microwaved. You felt that you were being cooked. The desert is remarkably clean because the blowing sand abrades everything. It gets in your eyes, it gets in your nose, it gets in your teeth. And we didn't have a lot of drinking water. We had water that the Saudis provided, but I wouldn't drink it. I went for over 2 months without a full body wash of any kind. What water we had, it was drinking water, and you couldn't waste it. Navigating in the desert was always tough because there were no roads. When you're back here or any other place, you just go down the street, go down the highway. But in the desert, it's just wide open. How are you going to get there? You do map and compass work and that sort of thing. But it's just survival skills. When the wind comes in the spring, it's called the shamal or the khamsan. The shamal means north. Khamsan means is 50, like the days of the north wind, unimaginably fierce. You cannot comprehend how fierce those sandstorms are. Nobody in America can say they know what it's like. It is terrible. But out in the desert was simply a matter of trying to survive in the heat, then in the dust, and then drinking water. It was very basic. It was a very basic existence.
Yeah. What did you do during the day? I mean, what's a day in the life look like?
What, in the desert during the war? It varied. Yeah. Some days it was absolute mind-numbing boredom. You were just bored.
Right.
It's like, my gosh, there's nothing to look at, nothing to do. You, on your own initiative, you had to start doing something. I wrote a lot of letters. You would get those little postcards during the Gulf War. It said, to any GI. And on the back, somebody would write, good luck, God bless, or something like that. And when the mail came, we'd get a bunch of these cards. And they'd get passed out, to any American soldier. And I swore then I would write a thank you letter to every card that I got. And I said, I don't care if it takes me a year, I will write a thank you. And when the war finally was over, and by the way, my family did come back. They were evacuated to Terrejón, Spain. And they came back, and I started writing thank you letters to all these people of these cards. And one time I even got a letter from the kindergarten class in New Hampshire. And they sent me a list of questions like, it's Friday, it's pajama day. Do you wear your pajamas in the war? Can you send us a camel? We want to see a camel. And so forth. But I wrote back to everybody. And then one day I got a letter back from the Wyoming State Training School in Lander. Now that at that time was the state home for the adult mentally handicapped that had no place to go. One of the residents there,
not far from Riverton,
down the road, one of the residents there, her name was Charlene, and my wife's name was Charlene. And the resident Charlene signed her name in a tough scrawl, but the transcribed note that said, good luck, God bless, all that kind of stuff. And I wrote Charlene back, and I said, Charlene, thank you. That's very kind of you, and God bless you, and thank you for supporting me. And then about a week later, I got another letter, and the letter was signed by all of the attendants in that cottage. And they said, of all the letters she wrote, I was the only one to write back and say thank you. And I have Charlene's, the patient Charlene's letter to this day. And that's what we did on a day-to-day basis. But when the actual fighting came, it was 2.5 days straight through, and it was tough.
What about it was tough?
We didn't know what was going on.
Okay.
The communications, the radios weren't working worth a damn. And we physically had to go to a lot of places in that town and do a physical reconnaissance to determine where the Iraqis were, what were they doing. And that was hard. And then if we were to call in airstrikes or call in the Marine gunships, helicopter gunships, we had to be out of the area that they were going to bomb. And the problem of unexploded ordnance came. Dud ammunition. You drop a bomb and the bomb doesn't explode. That was my specialty. Of course, during the Battle of Kafji, we were all fighting as infantrymen. But I got a radio call from my colleague, Jim Yonda, Major Yonda. Jim, by the way, lives in Salt Lake. And his call was 4-3 Juliet. My call was 4-4 Sierra. And he said, 4-4 Sierra, 4-3 Juliet, you got to get up here. And I went up to the custom house, and there was a 500-pound aircraft bomb had stuck in the asphalt, dud fired. And I had to render safe that bomb, or defuse it. That was
can I ask the question, how do you render safe a 500-pound dud aircraft bomb?
Carefully.
How long does that take?
Depends on the ordnance.
Okay.
We're trained to do that.
Okay.
I knew what it was. By inspection, I knew what the fuse was. And there are procedures that you remove the fuse.
Wow.
Yeah.
Nerve-wracking?
You get focused really quick. Not nerve-wracking because you're trained to do this, but you get focused very quick, and you think 2 and 3 times, is this the right thing to do? Not because you don't know what to do, but you want to make sure that when you put this tool on that bolt, is it the correct tool and the correct bolt? Because there is no room for failure.
Yeah, margin for error.
Yeah.
So when did you know that you were victorious? How does Kafji end?
It ended. The Iraqis didn't surrender, other than some POWs coming out of the building. They withdrew out of town on the afternoon of February 1st, 1991, which was a Friday. And they just left. And it's just one thing when you kind of look out the window, or you look out the window of your truck and you're looking over a building and they're no longer there anymore. And you're thinking, did they go? Did they leave? Yeah, I think so. And that's what happened. They just left. They didn't come out waving a white flag surrendering. They just left.
Yeah.
And that's how it ended.
Was that anticlimactic?
Yes.
Okay.
You would like to see a force come out, white flag, sit down at the table, and sign the surrender document, you shake hands, because that's what you remember how these things end. You remember in schooling, and the Japanese surrendered and the Germans surrendered and so forth. But the Battle of Kafji, they just left.
Yeah.
They just pulled out and left.
This was a war. I mean, I remember watching it live on CNN. It wasn't, and I know how happy you must be to hear that. But it wasn't even the 5 o'clock news like with Huntley and Brinkley and Cronkite. This was actual. I remember as bombs started flying, as Scud missiles started. We were watching it live, the greenish glow on TV, of night TV and stuff. What kind of communication did you have, and did you know that this war was being broadcast kind of in real time?
No.
Okay.
we were very isolated. We were isolated up on the border. I did have a pocket Sony shortwave radio, little pocket thing that I still have, by the way. And I would listen to the BBC,
okay,
British Broadcasting Company. Radio Riyadh, a state-controlled radio, said nothing about the Iraqi invasion. Nothing. It was just another day, another walk in the woods. So I was listening to the BBC, and they were telling us the bombing had started and things of that nature. And we also listened to Baghdad Betty. In war, there's Tokyo Rose, Axis Sally. Well, we had Baghdad Betty. The voice of peace, radio at Baghdad. And of course, that was the voice of Saddam Hussein. But we'd be listening to Baghdad Betty and insulting her femininity and all sorts
right.
of things.
Right.
But that's how I knew what was going on.
How was Baghdad Betty spinning the Iraqi side of the war?
That they were defending Iraq from the American aggression. That Americans were truly the aggressor because we supported Israel, and that our presence there was a threat to the Arabs, and they were defending, that the Iraqi forces were defending against our aggression. That's what I heard her say.
Wow. Did they talk about invading Kuwait? Did the Iraqi people know that they were headed into Kuwait, or?
I don't know. I don't know, Darryl.
I was just really curious how that was spun. Yeah. Did you think we were going to be engaged in the Mideast in a long time, or what were you, after Kafji? What happened, and what did you think?
Oh, I knew we were going to be there a long time. My advisory group had been in Saudi Arabia since 1976.
Okay.
At the invitation of the Saudi government, at the full funding of the Saudi government. And after the war, I knew that we were going to be sitting there for maybe another generation.
Why? Why did you know that?
Stability. The Saudi government was not then, and still isn't, a stable place. I had several Saudi officers in quiet conversation, and by the way, they would speak flawless English because they were educated back here in America, and then they went back to the kingdom, as we called it. In one-on-one conversations out in the middle of the desert, they would say that they did not support the government, the Saudi government. They did not support the Saudi king, and they had a lot of very unsettling things to say. And at one time, I pulled a Saudi captain aside, and I said, "You can't say that." I said, "They will deem that treason, and you'll be shot." He was advocating a coup, and I said, "My goodness, you just don't say those things if you want to stay alive." So the amount of unrest, the unrest was there in the Saudi officers, not to a full extent, but it was noticeable.
What did they resent about the kingdom?
The arrogance. In Saudi Arabia, there is the Arabs have tribal and family delineations. And if you're not a member of that specific tribe or that specific family, then you don't get the fruits. Mm-hmm. And the family of Al Saud has been there since King Abdulaziz in the early 20th century. And that family has controlled Saudi Arabia since. And well, not everybody over there is from that family. We call them Saudis. And one time a Saudi officer said, "Don't call me that." He said, "I am not a member of the families of Al Saud." And so then I realized that there is a distinction there. Mm-hmm. We say we're Americans. Yeah. But over there, when we say, "Well, you're Saudis," and they'll tell you, "No, we are not. We are not members of the House of Al Saud."
So what do they call themselves?
Their family name. Okay. The Tuajiris, and so forth. The Tuajiri family is very prominent over there. Mansur Alisa, he was from that tribe. And so there's that tribal designation over there. Mm-hmm.
I love that you became a student of that culture. And did that well, I shouldn't assume, but I'll ask the question, in what way did that enrich or add to your life?
Certainly enriched it, just an understanding of the world, understanding of the world's cultures. I think that's a disadvantage to Americans, is that we don't have a global perspective on other cultures. And when we do, we have a tendency to judge that. And when overseas, you'll regularly encounter people who speak 3 and 4 languages and speak them fluently, whereas in America, that's not the case. You can argue that either way, saying, well, we're America and we are a melting pot. And we do accept immigrants, and we have accepted immigrants in accordance with our law, and that's okay. But when you get to another foreign country and live there, I don't mean just be a tourist on a tour boat or something like that, but live there. That's when you get a whole new appreciation of how wonderful America is in our democracy, how wonderful our economy is, how wonderful women's rights are in America, and how wonderful religious freedom here is. And those things don't exist to that extent worldwide. So being in that culture enriches my understanding of the world, and it also helps me to be a lot more patient man.
Yeah. What did you think of the Saudi culture? What were the people like? What was it like?
We were treated wonderfully.
Okay.
They were polite, pleasant. Again, we chose not to be the ugly Americans. We were quiet and polite and so forth. Again, not in a condescending way, because that's just the way we live. And the Saudis, on a day-to-day level, are just like anybody. They want to have a good life for their family, for their children. They want to have good education. They want safety. They want to be happy. And sometimes we get a skewed view of another culture, and that skewed comes from the media.
No, you can say it. I'm not offended.
Mostly from the television and mostly from the internet now. And it is stereotyped to a certain extreme, and I'm just going, that is not correct. Of course, in America, we have our John Dillingers, we have our Charles Mansons, but we're not like that.
Yeah.
So why should we look at some Muammar Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein and stereotype everybody in the Middle East in that regard?
Yeah.
They're not that way.
What recently, too, the Saudi government, Mohammed bin Salman, has been under attack for some of his international dealings, rights of women, treatment of journalists, Jamal al-Khashoggi,
yes.
all of that. it's seen as a repressive, somewhat of a there's at least an idea of a somewhat repressive culture, especially when compared to American rights. How do you, when you see those headlines about Saudi Arabia or about the Saudi family, how do you square that with your time there, or is there any squaring?
I see that it is improving. When you talk about the rights of citizens, the rights of women, the acceptance of other cultures, that doesn't mean you agree with it. That means that you don't repress it. I see that they have, of course, the Gulf War was 28 years ago, something like that, an entire generation ago. What I see now is a new generation of Saudi coming into power, coming into influence. And they are in the middle of leading their nation, their country, their people into a more global awareness, a more global economy, where in the past they were very xenophobic and isolated and closed. And that new generation of Saudi leadership has got to serve two masters. The old generation are still in power, but they have to lead forward. And how to do that on a day-to-day basis, to what level you do it, are you strong over here, light over here? I see that as a day-to-day challenge, but they have come a long way from when my wife and son and I lived there for a little over 2 years.
How did leaving Saudi Arabia
go? In our case, well, after the war, when the parades and everything, we didn't go back to America. We stayed in Riyadh, and we saw the parades and everything, and I'm glad that happened, but that didn't happen to us. We left Saudi Arabia because I had an opportunity to go back to Germany and to go back to Europe, and we needed a rest. We were a very tired family. So it was the end of a tour of duty, and we were sent to Germany by my request. We thought it was going to be a relaxing tour. It was the worst 2 years of my Army life. And then I found myself dealing with Bosnia.
Why was Germany the worst 2 years of your life?
Because of the Army leadership at that time.
Yeah.
The command leadership of the U.S. Army Europe at that time was deficient.
Okay. We did the first Gulf War, and then we went back. I think a lot of people kind of meld and mesh that together, and that's not necessarily right. What do you want people to remember about the first Gulf War?
I would want them to remember first that it existed, that sometimes these wars in time get relegated to obscurity, and that people, they know something happened way back then, but I want them to remember that brave Americans went there, and with a noble intent, and that America was trying hard not to replicate Vietnam, and that our intentions to provide freedom to others who cannot do it for themselves is still an extraordinarily noble venture. And, God bless America for doing that.
Yeah. What about desert warfare? What's different? I mean, before the Gulf War, we had gone from fighting in jungles, and now we're fighting in desert. How well prepared were you to fight in the desert?
We weren't.
Why? What about it? What about it made us ill-prepared or not prepared?
The U.S. Army at that time, since beginning largely at Korea, was prepared to fight a land battle with the Soviet Union in Europe. Our enemy, as we defined it, was the Soviet Union, communism in Europe. The U.S. Army was organized, trained, equipped to fight a land battle in Europe. And suddenly we have this battle in the wide open desert. We weren't trained to do that. Our equipment was not developed to do that. Our uniforms were not developed to do that.
Give me some examples.
In the desert, a lot of dust, a lot of dirt.
Yeah.
That sand chews up an engine like you wouldn't believe. It chews up helicopters. It gets into turbine blades like you wouldn't believe. Fuel. When you are moving a fast-moving armored force, you are drinking fuel like you would not, like Niagara Falls amounts of fuel. We weren't prepared to do that. The Saudis helped us with that. The training for the individual soldier in tremendous heat. How do you do that when you're wearing all of the protective gear?
And you don't have a lot of water.
We don't have a lot of water. The rations we got. And now when we deployed with the Saudis, we ate goat meat and about anything we could come up with. By the way, goat meat isn't bad. But the Army did not had these dehydrated rations they call MREs, meals ready to eat. And you have to put water in them. Well, what do? You have just enough water to drink, so you can use that water to drink or to mix your food. Also, when those dehydrated rations get in you, and if you don't put enough water in there, they inflate and plug you up. And you'll get constipated like you couldn't believe. But the Army never, to my knowledge, figured out that when you're in the desert, water isn't abundant. And you've got a choice. Do I drink the water or do I mix my food? Either way, I'm going to run out. Something as simple as that. Uniforms. Guys were coming in with green uniforms designed to fight in Europe. We're in the desert. Wearing green is not what you want to do. So this whole idea of being prepared to fight in Europe and suddenly we're now down in the desert caught the Army completely by surprise.
How long did it take, or did it ever correct itself?
That's a tough one, Daryl. I think it didn't correct itself for about another 10 years because the Army had to completely transition from of course, when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union fell in the early 1990s, America had all this equipment designed to fight in Europe, and now they had to transition to fighting in the desert. And it took them several years to. Well, I'm not sure they even have.
I imagine that things like artillery, guns, ammunition, those things jam or get. Sand is not good. I know enough about guns where sand is not your friend.
You have to keep them clean. Keeping your just something simple as a small arm or a pistol, a 9mm pistol. Actually, we had them wrapped in cellophane. And then we unwrapped them only when we knew that hostilities were imminent.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So you go over, you do Bosnia. I don't want to say you do Bosnia. What was that experience like? Because that was a totally different experience for you.
Yes, it was refugee relief, refugee support. We were working with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees out of Geneva. And the U.S. government has said that we would support the refugee problem in Bosnia by refugee relief through the UNHCR. And that manifested itself by the United States Army Europe providing relief supplies and the United States Air Force Europe dropping them via parachutes. So we would come up with supplies, just kinds of stuff, put them in on a pallet, and plan an airdrop. That sounds reasonably simple, but it got complex One of the things was the Air Force didn't want to drop at low levels because for ground fire. Well, I don't know what to tell the Air Force, but you do take gunfire, and you can't drop parachutes at 20,000 feet with accuracy. So a lot of our airdrops went awry. The refugees did not get their supplies. In fact, the bad guys got the supplies. We ran out of parachutes. We ran out of 22-foot airdrop parachutes. And I got on the phone to my colleague over in the British Army of the Rhine, and I said, "Hey, Reggie, you guys got some parachutes laying around?" And the British government did not provide ground forces into Bosnia by their government decision. I said, "Reggie, here's an idea for the Brits to look good. If you can supply parachutes, then you can say the British are supporting the refugees." Well, he liked that idea. I guess he got permission from the Queen or something like that. But the Brits were supplying the parachutes because America had run out of them. And the company that made these parachutes was in Arkansas, and they had like about 20 older women who sewed the parachutes, but no contract had been let. So I have this vision of these Arkansas women just making parachutes.
And sending them to England and then getting them back to the American Army, right? That actually makes sense. Somehow that did you? I want to jump back really quickly.
Yeah.
When you were in Saudi Arabia, and you're going through this, it's war and it's all that, but you're an officer and you've got young soldiers. How are you in gunfire? How are you in these really trying conditions? How do you keep your wits about you and also make sure that they're doing okay?
Well, I need to clarify that, Daryl. We, as advisors, we were in a small advisory team,
Okay.
and we were all commissioned officers, and the NCOs we had were senior NCOs. We didn't have individual troops.
Okay.
We didn't, so I couldn't comment on that.
Okay. Let's talk about exit from the Army. When did you finally retire, and how did that happen?
In the Gulf War, I was injured. I was not combat wounded. I do not have a Purple Heart, but I tore up my knees. I broke my ribs, and you mend from those injuries, but you don't heal. And the injuries were catching up with me. I had a desk job as a lieutenant colonel, which I liked. We were involved in some strategic situations, which I liked because I was good at it. But I knew that I knew that the injuries were coming back. My legs were hurting, and so forth. And I knew that I could not maintain the physical standard that not only the Army requires, but I always said that if I could not maintain a physical standard as a combat soldier, then I need to get out of the Army. And on top of that, the Army wanted to send me to Korea, and I said, "I'm not going." And they said, "Yes, you're going." I said, "I'm not going." So it was 22 years, and I said, "It's time to go." And I talked to my wife about it, and I said, "It's time to go."
Why, for the world traveler, why were you wanted to see the world beyond Riverton, Wyoming?
Yeah.
Why no Korea?
Korea was different. It wasn't the intensity of the 8th Army and the 2nd Infantry Division in Korea. You were facing the North Korean Army. And I said, I came out of the Gulf. I came out of Bosnia support. And I don't feel that I was up to facing another high intensity situation.
Okay.
I said, I've done my share. I think it's time to go.
I want to jump tracks. You are instrumental. You come back home, and you could have gone fishing, although you said you're not great at that. Let me ask you about the Yellowstone Veteran Cemetery. You had a big role in that. You helped make a book. Why the cemetery issue? Why get involved in that?
When we came here, I just got involved in veterans issues, ranging from medical issues to transportation issues. And then I heard that a group of veterans wanted a veteran cemetery here. And I immediately thought, I said they're going to be climbing a high hill, because in time they're going to be up against the Veterans Administration or the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. And somebody said, well, did you want to get involved in this? I said, sure. And what I found was some very dedicated and remarkable citizens and people and veterans. But unfortunately, their understanding of things, if they were wanting to work with U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, was very limited. They meant well, their intentions were true, but sometimes you have to have a plan other than to call your senator and badger him. I was vice chairman of that board, and I knew that they did not have a strategic plan to approach the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs and work with the National Cemetery Administration. And with that, on my own, I started calling the VA and explaining the situation, and I knew that we had to counter the VA's argument that we didn't have enough people out here. And given that, I helped write the executive paper to then VA Secretary Eric Shinseki, and saying, you can't dismiss us out here just because there's not enough of us. And a long process, and we were extraordinarily fortunate to get that cemetery first established, and then have it designated as a national cemetery. And it's a remarkable, wonderful place. Because of that, I wrote and published the history of that cemetery. And as an outgrowth of that, Montana Senator Tester nominated me to serve on the National Advisory Committee to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs on cemeteries and memorials, and I'm currently on that committee. And as I said earlier, I'm the only member of that committee living west of the Mississippi River now.
Why is it important? And I don't mean to ask probably an obvious question, but I'm going to do it anyway because I'm not sure that I know the answer. Why is it important for veterans to have a cemetery? Why was it that important for that much of an undertaking?
Good question. Deserves a good solid answer because taxpayers fund it. What it isn't an outgrowth of an ego. What it is a statement of honor that when America asks, and in sometimes requires, especially in the draft, when American citizens just come off the street and defend everything we believe in, that service, be it volunteer or otherwise, is an honored thing. America has never been a martial society, meaning a military society. And when we call upon people to do that, we are calling on them to serve in something which we may not be all that comfortable in. But Americans step forward and they say, this we will defend, meaning we'll defend America and everything we stand for. And that deserves our lasting honor, that deserves our lasting thanks, and that deserves veterans the right, the earned right to be together in death and burial as brothers, as they were in war. And that's why we do this. I also say the greatest tragedy, and I said this earlier, that can face a veteran is not that they may be killed in action, The greatest tragedy is they are forgotten. And America must never, ever forget what veterans have done for this nation, from Lexington Green in the Revolutionary War to currently now in the many places we serve in hostile areas in the world.
As a lifelong military man, do you see where we're serving? Does our military involvement concern you?
Yes, it does. We are now involved in things that we are not sure why we're there. When you ask a question, Mr. President, Senator, why are we there? That question needs to be regularly asked, and if we're not getting the answers as citizens, then demand the answer or vote them out and get somebody in who can answer that. We are in places now that are stretching the United States Armed Forces in ways we have never been stretched before. And as I said earlier in this video, we are now a country that is perilously close to being complacent about all of this. And we must never do that.
How do we, with a lot of our soldiers coming back, one of the things that's amazing is the medical technology to save people now is greater than it's ever been, and that is no more true than in combat and war. But we save them, and they may not only have physical but emotional and mental injuries as well. How does America best prepare for that, for the next generation of soldiers who will need and in fact deserve a lifetime of care?
Very appropriate question. I'm not really in the position to talk about that in a level of expertise other than a reasonable man. I don't have a medical background or things of that nature, but I do know that I have visited the National Intrepid Center in Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. That's where the traumatic brain injuries go to. And I've also personally visited the prosthetic ward in Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. And I have personally observed what the treatment is given to the military people who have suffered these kinds of physical wounds and mental wounds. And I was pleased at what I saw. Mm-hmm. When they transfer to the VA, when they are medically retired from the government or from the military, and they're transitioned into the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs care, that care is comprehensive, and in many times it comes under intense scrutiny. I personally have been seen in the VA in 3 different areas. 3 generations of my family have been treated medically in the VA, and the treatment I have received has been excellent to outstanding. The initiatives to look at these kinds of injuries, I think, must continue. We are a technology gadget kind of people. We like to build things, and how to interface that with a terribly wounded body will remain a challenge that I know America is up to, and America wants to do it. The Intrepid Center in Washington, D.C. at Walter Reed, when I visited, we're doing things I couldn't even imagine to care for military who have traumatic brain injuries. So what I saw there made me feel good, made me feel positive.
Mm-hmm. That's good. It's good to see that smile. What was the feeling like when you got the cemetery, when you knew the cemetery was a reality? When did you know it was a reality, and what is why do you keep on working with it?
When we knew that then VA Secretary General Eric Shinseki, Army retired, was going to agree to it, I didn't feel any exultation. It was a relief. It was like when you have finished a long distance run
Yep.
And when you cross the finish line, yeah, you're glad it's over. You're just you're happy it's done, but there's no energy to cheer. We were up against the VA, a deeply entrenched bureaucracy in some cases. And I remember writing in the executive summary to the report we presented to General Shinseki that, in fact, I quoted Steinbeck in that report. I said, some people worship the numbers as a refuge from feeling. And all we got from the VA is, you don't have the numbers. And I put that quote prominently. And I said, Steinbeck says, some people worship the numbers because it's a refuge from feeling. And when the VA finally agreed to make that a national cemetery, I didn't feel like cheering. I just felt that it was a relief.
Do you have a favorite moment out at the? Because you've seen a lot there, and I believe cemeteries can be sacred places and places of great meaning, not just repositories for bodies. Do you have a favorite moment out there?
Yes.
Can you tell me it?
Very early, after it received its national designation, I was out there doing something. I live about 1.5 miles from the cemetery. I'm out there regularly. And I was, I can't remember what I was doing, but I watched an elderly woman walking up and down the headstones, and she seemed a bit confused. And I quietly walked up to her and I said, ma'am, may I help you? And she said, well, I'm looking for a grave. And I said, what grave? And she gave me the name. And I said, yeah, you're not far off. And so we walked down there, and she stood in front of that grave, and she said, and I backed off. I gave her some physical space. And then she turned at me and she said, he wanted to be buried here. And that was a powerful moment.
Yeah, yeah, it's a beautiful place. Let me ask the one of the other things that you do that I'm so impressed with. You have had this almost one-man crusade to remember the World War I, the female soldiers from Montana.
Yes.
How did you come about that, and why has that become a mission? It's an amazing story, and I would love for you to share it.
Blame it on Florence.
Okay.
Florence Ames.
Okay.
United States Army, Nurse Corps, World War I. Buried in Billings Mountain View Cemetery on the hill facing east. Years ago, and I mean probably 10 years ago, I was helping set American flags on the veteran's grave in Mountain View Cemetery. And I saw an upright white marble headstone from the back. I didn't see any name on it. I said, the veteran's there. I'll put a flag in the ground. And so I walked up to this headstone on top of the hill and stuck the American flag in the grave, and I looked at it, and it said, Florence Ames, nurse, U.S. Army Nurse Corps, World War I. And at the bottom of her headstone are the lyrics to the bugle tune Taps. And that headstone utterly captivated me. And I said, who is this Florence? Why is she buried alone? And who put the lyrics to the bugle tune Taps on her headstone? And she died in the 50s, 1950s, born in 1880s or something like that. And I've been a genealogist for over 40 years. And I started finding the history of Florence and found that she was a remarkable Montana woman in her own right. She was born in Nebraska, was trained a nurse in Chicago, moved with her family to Billings. Her father was a sheep rancher. And she was one of the very first, they were called graduate nurses at that time. They weren't called registered nurses. She was the first graduate nurse in Billings, traveled throughout Montana, teaching people about tuberculosis. She was the original member of the Montana Board of Nursing, and she served in war. And I said, who is this remarkable woman? So, and I thought, if there's one, there's got to be two. And so I started just walking through the cemeteries and finding the women who said World War I on it. And I started making a list of these women, and the list grew and grew. And I found over 20 women who entered the service from Billings or Yellowstone County. They may have been born elsewhere, but they entered the service from Yellowstone County. Most of them were nurses. And I began following them in history and what they did. One of the nurses was Harriet O'Day. She's buried in the Laurel City Cemetery. And I found that she was decorated for heroism under artillery fire near Verdun in World War I. And she came back after the war, and she was the head nurse and chief nursing instructor at the Billings Polytechnic Institute that we call Rocky Mountain College. Married late in life, no kids, but stayed here. And she and her husband, also World War I veteran, are buried side by side in the Laurel City Cemetery. And nobody knew that. So this whole effort to find these women and record their history started me on about an 8-year journey. I found them locally. I was very fortunate to have the Disabled American Veterans Chapter 10 here in Billings sponsor the Yellowstone County Women's plaque on the courthouse lawn. That was a remarkable ceremony. I found a nurse who had been buried in an unmarked grave in Mountain View Cemetery for over 90 years, Annie Sampson. That was a heartbreaking story. Then it expanded to Montana as a whole, and I worked with the state archives, I worked with the National Archives, and I found over 212 women in Montana entered the military from Montana. Only 50 of them were born here, but the rest of them came here. And I've decided to write their story. It took me about a year to write the book, and it was published last year on these remarkable women.
That's a wonderful mission. What do you think they'd tell you if they heard that they were part of a book?
I don't know. I found very little on these women because they were not allowed to keep journals or diaries in the war. They were not allowed to take cameras. I don't know what they would have said.
And they were treated differently because they were women than a regular...
Yes. The nurses entered the Army Nurse Corps. However, they were not given full benefits and rank as the men until 1948. So even in World War II, these nurses did not have full rank and privileges as the men and benefits as the men. They fought the government for full recognition and full benefits. The women telephone operators, they were called the Hello Girls. Officially, they were the members of the Women's Telephone Unit of the American Signal Corps. They were the telephone operators in France. 5 of them came from Montana. And my research showed 5 of them came from Montana. And 4 of us formed an informal research committee. Dr. Elizabeth Cobbs, PhD, history, Texas A&M. She wrote the book on the Hello Girls. Mr. James Theros, Madison, Wisconsin, he produced a documentary on them. Me, because I was researching them in Montana. And Mr. Zachary Austin at the World War I Centennial Commission, he asked me to validate a list. And so the 4 of us kind of came together as a research committee. And with that, Senator Tester has put in legislation to give the Congressional Gold Medal to these Hello Girls.
So once again, women in war not recognized?
No. The Army looked at the telephone operators as just civilian contractors. They did not get military status until 1978.
Were any of them around in 1978?
Just a few.
That would have been 60 years, 60
Yeah. A few of them are still alive, but most of them had passed away.
I know that sometimes people look for their loved ones' history in war, especially if they were discovered or didn't know about it. Some veterans never talked about it, and they come across something in a box or something like that. I know that you have helped people discover their family histories, being a genealogist. Why do you do that?
Fair question. My view is in the armed forces. I certainly can speak for the Army, and I think I'm confident speaking for the other services, that we don't leave anybody behind in body, in memory, and spirit. If we can't bring their body home, then we can certainly keep their spirit alive so that they are not forgotten. And when somebody wants to keep the history and the spirit of their ancestor alive, that is a noble calling. And if I can help them get a medal for their grandfather, or understand what he did, or now understand what she did, I am more than happy to help them. There are two initiatives nationally underway to do that officially. The Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress began in over 10 years ago to capture these stories from war veterans and preserve them forever. And the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs is just now beginning the Veterans Legacy Program, so that you could go out to a national cemetery, and if you see a headstone, you can actually take a smartphone and bring up their history. I'm working that too, by the way. And it is in what we call beta form, test form, but it went online as a test about 2 weeks ago.
That's wonderful technology. What about when you connect people to their past? Sometimes people they didn't even know. What's that like?
Rewarding. When you see the family get this sense of honor that their ancestor or their family member did some extraordinary things. That is a great reward for me.
Do you have a favorite story of someone that you found, or a good memory?
Yes, but unfortunately, it's not a pleasant one.
Okay.
I was contacted through Senator Tester's office contacted me to do the research on a situation that was presented to the senator by a family. Their family member was died during the Vietnam era. The family thought that the family member was on some sort of special operations CIA mission or something like that, and the government wasn't being truthful with them about what this family member did. And I told Senator Tester's office that I would undertake the research for them and provide them a report. I researched the service member and found that what the family was thinking was wrong. The service member, and by the way, the service member's name at that time, and still is on the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., the so-called wall, as it is called. My research showed that this service member was not killed in action, was not on any sort of special operations mission, that they had died in an industrial accident in the Philippines. I wrote this, and I actually found an eyewitness, and I called the witness, or the person I thought witnessed it, and a long distance call, and I explained who I was and what I was doing, and I said, I think that you have personal knowledge of this. And the man on the other end wasn't saying anything. And I said, that I believe you have personal knowledge of this. Would you like to share this with me? And then he broke down on the phone and would start crying. He was just bawling, and he just kept saying, I couldn't get him out, I couldn't get him out, I couldn't get him out. I said, what do you mean? He said, it was in a warehouse fire, and he died in a warehouse fire. He said, I grabbed a ladder and I couldn't get him out. And I said, was he involved in any support mission for Vietnam? He said, oh, no. So I wrote this, and I also found an MP report, an official military police report on it. Put this all together, wrote it, signed my name to it, and I contacted his sister, who originally contacted Senator Tester, and so that's the circle here. And I called her and I said, you need to know this. And I said, this is what I found. And I said, I have found an eyewitness. She promptly excoriated me on the phone that I was part of the conspiracy and so forth. And I said, no, ma'am. I said, I'm being truthful. And I said, this is a report I'm sending to Senator Tester, and I did. And I stand by the report. But I think to this day, she probably has concluded that I was lying, but I wasn't. That was a hard one.
Yeah, because sometimes you got to go where the facts lead, right? I mean,
sometimes these experiences are not what you think they're going to be.
What do you hope, since that you've written, Ed, you've written other people's stories, you've gotten things done, what do you hope people remember about Ed Saunders?
Three things
okay.
that were told to me by my family. And my father, who was a very stoic man, he said, Ed, you're a brave man. My wife said that I'm an honest man. And my son said, I'm a good dad.
Can't beat those things. I can't add much to it. I just want to say thank you for sharing your story and stories. And not only thank you for your time in service, but I thank you for trying to preserve stories and preserve legacies vis-a-vis the cemeteries and the reports that you do. And thank you for your service on the veterans committees that you serve, because I think memorials, that those things are, memory is a powerful thing. And so I just want to thank you for all that, and thank you for agreeing to share your story with me today.
Well, thank you much, Daryl. I'm very pleased and proud that you asked me, and I hope that your time was worth it.
It was, absolutely. This has been Daryl Ehrlich with Ed Saunders on our Stories of Honor project.